Welcome to the Morning Prep Podcast. We've got a minute because the kids haven't started to line up yet. I'm your host, Nathan Van. So before we get started, I want you to consider what winter break has been like for a student that you teach. Now pick just one kid. I want you to picture their face, picture how they act in your class, how they respond to you over email or in person or when you're on Zoom and you talk to them directly through that platform. Think about what you know of their home life. Consider the conversations that you had with their parents. And as you've gotten to know their child, consider their struggles, consider the successes. And I want you to hold that all in your mind's eye for a moment for what their winter break just might have been like. Now, depending upon the student that you chose, winter break does not seem to be all that bad. However, we all know that this is not the case for every single student that we teach. We know that when we start to consider how they interact in class, what you know of their home life and what you know about from talking to their parents, that winter break probably is not the best time for them. So recall the story that I shared in episode 8 when all of those fights were breaking out on that day just before winter break. Now, for many of the students, school was a stabilizing force in their lives. It was predictable, the boundaries were clearly set, and the goals are relatively clear. Leaving school for 2 weeks disrupts that consistency that our students desperately crave. Additionally, for many of you, doing school remotely adds to the trauma for the very reasons mentioned, plus many others. So before we dive in a little bit deeper into this, let's take a quick word from our sponsor. So thank you for taking a moment just to listen to this little sponsored pitch. What we're going to be focused on for this little ad is something that you may not have heard of, which is Anchor.fm. Now, truth be told, have you had that killer idea for a podcast? Then Anchor.fm is your way to go. So what makes Anchor so good is the fact that it, first and foremost, it is free. That's actually what attracted me to it in the first place, was the fact that it was a zero financial investment. But the second piece is that there are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. So if you don't want to fiddle with any sort of like GarageBand or Traction or Waveform or any other recording program like that, I only named the ones that I knew off the top of my head, then you can do it right through the computer, right through your browser. Also, what Anchor likes to do is distribute your podcast for you so you can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many, many more. What also makes it phenomenal is the fact that you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. All right? No minimum. So you can start making money immediately. Now, the thing is that it is everything that you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm and get started. So, the drink for this week, it's something very different for me. It's Cafe Bustelo. I have never had it before. My wife bought it for me because I was always intrigued by it. And it's an espresso. Many of you know it. It's typically associated as like a Hispanic coffee. And I tried it for the first time. I made it using one of those Italian coffee pots. I forgot what they're called. But I made that and I made an Americano with it. So I just took about a shot of espresso from it and mixed it with hot milk and then mixed it with oat milk because I have acidity issues and the oat milk helps counteract that a little bit. And it makes a fantastic Americano. I highly recommend it. If you have not had Cafe Bustelo, if you've not had an Americano with oat milk, I recommend it. It's a delicious drink. But with that aside, let's dive into this week's episode as a whole. So really considering the student experience through the eyes of a specific student is one of the easiest and first things you can do to become a more trauma-informed teacher. So over the next 3 episodes, we're going to dive deeper into trauma and its impacts on the student and the classroom. This episode, its goal is to essentially be very actionable, something you can do quick, because especially if you're listening to this right after Christmas break, I want you to have some sort of tools in your toolbox to make sure that you are ready for whatever you're walking into. Next week's episode is going to look a little deeper at how trauma impacts and changes the brain. And then we're going to conclude the 3rd episode with how it alters the dynamics of your classroom. So being trauma informed, and just in a very truncated way, means that you recognize that students carry their trauma with them, and your aim is to design instruction and to respond in ways that will not re-traumatize students, and it will also aid them in the management of their trauma. Now, I have linked in the description an article that dives a little deeper into what it means, so please check it out when you have the time. So, as stated already, students do not leave their traumas and challenges at the door when they come into your classroom. I know we as adults, many of us have worked hard and practiced and learned how to check ourselves and control ourselves in those moments. But our students, again, they're still kids. They haven't necessarily learned how to do that. And of course, like, we always mess up sometimes. We always screw up. If we have a bad morning, we sometimes bring it into the classroom with us. And obviously, we have to learn how to check that in ourselves, but we have to be willing and able to teach and train our students in ways that are going to support them. So with me, in my own experience, when it comes to being trauma informed, there was just this ebb and flow in my practice where I became really aware of it and really unaware of it. But I think back to like the very first time when I realized that trauma informed instruction is a thing. And I think back to this one student that I had, and he was very, very reserved, very quiet, kept to himself. I mean, normally when people think of trauma-informed students, they think of those kids that are kind of off the wall or sometimes just really, really angry at everything and like to get into it with other people. This student, his trauma came in the way of just being very reserved and very to himself. He didn't really participate a lot in many classes. He didn't do a ton of work all the time, and he liked to write a lot and express himself in writing. And I realized that there was this one moment where our relationship just had a breakthrough, where he shared some of his poetry with me and he started to open up a bit more and participate significantly more in my class. And what I found out was that, and we're going to get into a little bit of why he started to do that. There was a number of reasons, but there were some things that I did that helped him open up in that regard. And what I found out was that he was effectively homeless. Like, he was doing a lot of couch surfing, and it was a fact that something that he was just really embarrassed by. So he tended to turn significantly more inward in order to manage that and manage that trauma in his own life. And when that was revealed to me, my mind was just really just blown in that moment. And it also, what it did is it caused me to reflect on that student and really sense like the signs were all there that, yeah, something was up. And I was just too ignorant in that moment to really recognize it. And so what I began to find out is that what was I doing to cause him to open up is one of the things that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And that was just simply talking to him and empathizing with him and just listening to him for himself. So one just practical way, we're gonna shift gears a little bit into the steps and the how, is that I think there's three easy things you can do to really make yourself a more trauma-informed instructor. And the first thing that you can do is the activity that we started with, of just putting yourself in your student's shoes and really considering their experience. The second piece is this calling in versus calling out. It's a chart that I saw on Facebook from this organization called Mindshift. And this chart is just, it clarifies a lot of like what I had to learn as a teacher and what I've had to incorporate into my practice. And then the third thing is really talk it out. And I'm gonna cover all of those in detail in just a moment. And so going back, looking at the activity that we started with, why it's really important to put yourself in the student's shoes, and it's just such a simple and basic thing to do, is that one, it refocuses you on why you're teaching. Sometimes we as teachers, we get so caught up in our own emotions, our own feelings, our own structure and organizations that we tend to forget why we're teaching. And taking those moments to just really reflect and sit on our students and their experiences and what they're thinking and what they're going through reminds us that we are helping in the process of growing adults. Essentially, we're helping take our students from adolescents or children or teenagers and bringing them along in the process of turning them into functioning adults. And so once we come back to that point of saying like, oh, this is our role and our responsibility, it begins to break down some of those barriers and issues that we have. And secondly, what it really does help with is help breaks down our own biases too, because sometimes, again, we get caught up in our own heads. We think everything is all right, or we tend to belittle certain things and certain reactions and responses and say like, oh, you're just being really arrogant, or you're just being really rude, or you're just being really mean, or you're being really cocky, or whatever adjective you want to throw on there for a student. And it causes us to actually stop and recognize like, no, this is not a bad kid. This is, yeah, sure, he does things that are bad that you wouldn't want your own kids doing, or you wouldn't want everybody in the class doing. But it helps really reframe your understanding of that student. So again, first, just focus in on individual students and try to understand who they are as people. The next major thing is, again, very practical and something that you can implement in your class. It's calling in versus calling out. Now, when I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw this little diagram, I already shared it on the Facebook page because I wanted everybody to see it and just spend time thinking about it. But it's called calling in or calling out. And what it is, and I'm just going to walk through every step of the chart and kind of add a little bit of extra commentary onto it. But it says calling in, it's when you talk to somebody privately about a harmful comment or action they may have made. And when to use it, it says when you have a relationship with the person, when you believe that the person is open to learning, when you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. And then, of course, it's more compassionate than calling out. And so it's recommended to try this first. Essentially, if a student is acting up in your class or doing something that you don't want them to do, it could be explicitly like they curse out another kid, or it could be much more subtle where they're just not participating. Calling in, walking up to them, asking them how they're doing, or just privately redirecting them in that moment, I think is significantly more beneficial to preventing from re-traumatizing students. Because sometimes what we as teachers tend to do is this second piece, calling out. When you announce in a public manner, I'm reading verbatim from the chart again, when you announce in a public manner that someone said or did something harmful. Now, when to use this, again, this chart clarifies when calling in is not possible, when calling in is not successful, when their words or actions are harmful to many people, and when the harmful comment or action was done in public. Again, calling out, sometimes we as teachers, we dive to this automatically. We're just like, oh, hey, you in the back, you're on your cell phone, cut that out right now. Or you just cut somebody out, cut that out right now, or your detention or whatever. And we just get it in our heads that like, oh, we got to nip it in the bud. And that's great. You want to nip it in the bud. Like that's exactly what you want to do. You don't want to leave things unattended to, because then it just leads to your classroom becoming chaotic and a room of disorder and a room where kids can do whatever they want. And so you don't want to be that, obviously. So you call it out. But sometimes what tends to happen is that if you don't know this now, learn it from me right now, is that sometimes when kids are acting out, they're looking for attention. They don't know how to get the attention they desire. And so they think acting out is the way to do it. And so they essentially yearn for that negative attention because that's the only attention that they guaranteed know how to get. And so we default to calling out. But what calling out sometimes tends to do is be more destructive to our classrooms. It sometimes can break down the culture of our rooms, break relationships, and cause more damage than we desire. And so looking at this chart, again, in the context of being more trauma-informed, in the context of not wanting to traumatize our kids or help them relive traumas that they may have experienced, calling in is the way to go. Really, look for every opportunity, because calling in, the chart says it's like when you have a relationship with that person. What that also does is it also builds a relationship with that student. I mean, you're not going to get a relationship with a kid if like the only time you ever talk with them and interact with them is you're calling them out and you're bringing attention to their negative behaviors. You build that relationship when you talk with them one-on-one, when you don't make their business public. So the first step, again, for making sure that we're being more trauma-informed is putting ourselves in students' shoes and really considering what they've experienced and what they're going through. And the second piece is making sure and being very discerning in your classroom between calling in and calling out. Now, this third way, I call it just talking it out. The school that I currently work at, they called it Take 10. And what it simply is that you're pulling the student from the room. You're essentially removing them from the environment for a moment, and you're privately speaking with them. Now, how it's different than calling in or calling out is that more often than not, with the calling in is you're just walking over to the kid's desk and you're being like, hey, cut that out. But what this means, what talking it out is you're taking the student from the circumstance and you're giving them an opportunity to process what they did and what happened and help you reset the expectation and build that relationship. So what the first piece of this is that it's like you don't resort immediately to punitive measures when students act out or students are just not doing what you want them to do, a specific student in this context. And you take a moment and you privately speak with them. So what you first want to do is obviously set the class on an independent activity, because you're going to want to take that student and just pull them into the hall and then just simply ask them how they're doing, what they did last night, anything to take their mind off the current circumstance. Like, especially if the student did something really egregious, especially if they did something that the chart would suggest like you call out for. You pull them from that circumstance, you pull them from that context, you pull them from all the public attention that they're looking to get, and you give them very private attention. And again, you pull them into the hall as well, so kids can't like peek and see and like overhear what's going on. And you first want to get their mind off the circumstance. You want to give them an opportunity to speak and speak to, honestly, whatever's on their mind. Because that's what makes it really important, is that first it helps diffuse the situation. And it helps, again, refocus their mind and kind of takes them out on left field. Because sometimes that's what's very helpful in those moments, is like you want to disrupt the flow of things for just a moment. Then after you've asked them that question, after you've gotten them to consider something else, after you've gotten them to just share their thoughts and feelings on whatever, you want to have them explain their side. Something like, okay, tell me what happened back there. If there was anything that you as a teacher did wrong, because sometimes these outbursts, sometimes these problems happen because there's something that you may have done either intentionally or unintentionally that set that student off. And what you're going to want to do is take ownership for the things that you did. This is a very humbling part. This is what you as a teacher have to really work at humbling yourself to do, is telling a student that you're sorry. It's very challenging to do sometimes, especially when you don't feel as if you did anything wrong. But you want to ask for their forgiveness, apologize. Again, like if you did something that, especially after reflecting, like you realize may have set them off. But you also want to reinforce what the expectation is. So like if they did something wrong, like explain to them what they did that was wrong and why it was wrong. Because sometimes, again, like helping students really recognize that what their behavior was just more or less a cry for attention, and say it's like, hey, if you're looking for something, there's ways to do it. And just the way that you were doing it was just not the best way. And then explain why the expectation exists. The thing is, like, there's many ways to have that private conversation, but this is my typical model. Again, like I pull a kid from the circumstance, I ask them how they're doing, I ask them what they're thinking about, or again, I try to find something that I know that they really like or enjoy and ask them their thoughts further on it. And then I bring them back to what the circumstance was, because the key is you want to help de-escalate them from where they were at and get them to be more open to hearing what you have to say. So that seems simple enough. Obviously, you'd think what it's like to be the student, you'd be very discerning in when you're going to talk privately to a student versus calling the kid out. And then you also have individual conversations with kids as the need arises. Super simple. Not always when it is in the middle of class. Not always when you're trying to start an assignment. Not always when you are in the middle of, say, like a small lecture or something like that. But the key is that, remember, your students are bringing baggage with them into the classroom. They're bringing their struggles, they're bringing their problems, their insecurities, their issues into your room, and it's playing out before your eyes. You as the adult in the room, you as the educator, you as the professional need to practice at standing above all of that for a moment and being able to monitor what is really important. And in those moments, what is important is the emotional development of that child into an adult. And so checking yourself and giving them the time and space to kind of breathe and think through what they're doing and helping them grow in that regards is going to go significantly farther. And so there's the very real practical ways that this is beneficial in terms of, again, helping develop these children into adults. There's also those more selfish ways of like your classroom management is going to get significantly better as you start to really develop those deep relationships with students, because I've noticed, and this is just a trend throughout life, that strong relationships are built through fire. When there's challenging circumstances, that's sometimes, more often than not, where the strongest relationships are built. And so think about that. When you're correcting those students and when you're working with them through these things, you're building that relationship and you're investing into those kids. So your homework is to, again, practice the intro activity. Think through as many students as you can and walk through it. And again, get your mind set right on what is going on in their lives and building that empathy for them, because that is the first step to being trauma informed. So I'm really looking forward to next week when we dive into how trauma impacts the brain. It's brain development in just theories of understanding the brain is such a really fascinating aspect of education that I've just been noticing in the past couple of years, beginning a lot of traction and really taking education to that next level, because it's forcing teachers to think more like scientists, because you can't forget, to one extent or another, you are a scientist. And so I'm really excited for next week's episode, but I'm also really happy that you all are a little bit better equipped now with some tools and strategies to be a little bit more trauma informed than you were before. So look forward to next week's episode. Again, we're releasing these on Tuesdays, so be on the lookout for that as well. And also be sure to follow and like us on Facebook at Morning Prep Pod. And if you have any questions or an episode to suggest, you can always send me an email at morningpreppod@gmail.com. So this was the Morning Prep Podcast. The bell is about to ring, and I will see you in the classroom.